Greetings, everybody. I join you today on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I acknowledge them as the traditional owners of the country on which I live, work, and walk. I'm inspired and nurtured by the wisdoms, spiritualities, and experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from across this land and from First Nations people across the world. I promise to walk softly and gently on this land and to work actively for reconciliation, justice, equity, and healing. I would like to acknowledge elders, past, present, and emerging, and pay my respects to any First Nations people who may be joining us today or who may watch this video at some point.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a joy. It's good to be with you. So I welcome you all on behalf of the Jewish Christian team of the Sisters and Family of Our Lady of Sion in Australia. Promoting understanding and dialogue between Christians and Catholics and Jews is part of the charism of this family. It's an important part of the life and teaching of the Catholic Church, especially since Nostra Aetate was promulgated in 1965. On a practical note, I want to remind all of you who are wanting accreditation, the CECV PD accreditation for this session, to please send via chat to me, Mary Reaburn, your name and your email address. So the name you want on your certificate and your email address so we can send it to you. But I need your name there as well. And then within the next 2 weeks, we will send you your certificate of accreditation. So they're the practical things over, except that I want to thank Garratt Publishing very much. They have assisted us in sending out and in recording the names of people who wanted to participate, and I'm very grateful to them. Today's topic has its origins in the person of Jesus, but became a question as a fruit of the Second Vatican Council and especially Nostra Aetate, the document on the Catholic Church's relationship with other faith traditions, and for our topic, especially the document in relation to the Jewish people. The relationship between Jews and Christians has been a troubled relationship. It was so in the early years when the followers of Jesus were a small group within Judaism. It became a bigger problem when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and later, while Christianity, including Catholicism, was linked with the political power in most European countries. Power imbalances can be the source of a great deal of injustice and pain. Tonight, we look at the topic, the characters called the Jews in John's Gospel. Our Gospels contain sayings and texts which in today's context seem anti-Jewish. The social and religious context have changed enormously since the time of the formation and eventual writing of the Gospel texts. What likely began as arguments between two groups within Judaism has had serious consequences in history, and the worst of these was the Holocaust, the Shoah. This was so because the two groups slowly separated and the comments were no longer within the wider family, but were seen to be hurled at those thought to oppose the person of Jesus, or who, in fact, were the neighbours down the street with whom the community of the evangelists did not agree. Mary Coloe will take up this challenge in relation to the Gospel of John. This Gospel presents the Jews as characters within the Gospel, thus the title. The problem is that when these texts are read, especially read in church, they can sound anti-Jewish. How do we understand these texts today so that we do not hear them in this way? And even more importantly, that we do not contribute to disrespect or hatred of the Jewish people then in Jesus' time or today in our time. How can we read John's Gospel today so as not to promote anti-Jewish sentiments, thoughts, and attitudes? It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Mary Coloe, a long-time scholar of John's Gospel, a world-renowned Johannine expert. She currently teaches at Yarra Theological Union within the University of Divinity in Melbourne, Australia. Her research interests are the theology, Christology, ecclesiology, and spirituality of the Gospel of John. Also, Jewish-Christian relationship in the 1st century, and the world and literature of 1st century Judaism and Christianity. She is an engaging speaker and will lead us into this topic and help us to engage the text of John's Gospel so that we can both critique it and appreciate it. Thank you very much, Mary. We really look forward to your paper. It's a joy to welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you for the invitation, and to all of you who are participating. First of all, I'm a Catholic, right? I'm a Catholic nun, a presentation sister, and I say that because I've had students think I'm Jewish. I had a student come to me one day and say, Mary, I know you're a Jew, but we Catholics think, and off she went to tell me what Catholics think. And then I had to say, well, actually, I'm a Catholic and I'm a nun. Well, she got an enormous shock, but it pleased me that my way of teaching came across as appreciative of, respectful of the Jewish faith, because I couldn't think of doing it any other way. Okay, I'm just sharing my screen with you. This is the Greek word for the Jews. The Greek word can also be translated as the Judeans. So occasionally I'll make that distinction, but that's what it looks like in Greek. The first part of this talk will be giving you some insight into the world of 1st century Judaism in its many forms. And out of 1st century Judaism came a new group of Jews, but followers of Jesus. So that will be the first part. Then we'll have a break. And then I want to look at some of the difficult texts, particularly a text that where Jesus appears to be saying to the Jews, your father is the devil. So we need to look at that very carefully. Okay, so I hope we're all in business now. John and the Jews. And I want to begin with this quote from a Jewish man, as you can see by his name, Israel Abrahams, and it was an address given to the Cambridge University's Theological Society. And Israel Abrahams was the reader in rabbinics at the university, saying, to us Jews, the 4th gospel is the most Jewish of the 4. A statement I would thoroughly agree with. And yet, look at what else we see. In John 8:44, you are from your father the devil, and you choose to do your father's desire. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. And in John chapter 4, salvation is from the Jews. So how can we hold those absolute contradictions? The gospel, the most Jewish, and yet with such a harsh statement, making sense of this? Well, I think we can make sense of it if we understand what was going on in the first century and how the gospel developed and who were this group of Jesus followers. So I want to begin by showing you that Judaism of the first century was multi-dimensional. There were many ways of being Jewish. Just as in Melbourne, there are very many ways of being a Victorian. You could even barrack for Collingwood and still be Victorian. Or you could play soccer and still belong in Melbourne. A great varieties of being Jewish. So here are some ways. The Pharisees get rather bad press in our Christian Gospels. But Mary Reaburn, myself, any of you who are teachers, you would be considered a Pharisee because you are a lay teacher, you are progressive, you are open to new ideas, you value what's been written in the scriptures and also the ongoing teaching of the rabbis. So that's the progressiveness of Pharisees. There are things they believe in that some Jews don't, such as resurrection. So Pharisees are lay teachers following the written and oral Torah or law, quite progressive. In contrast, the priestly group, they're called the Sadducees. They're a much more conservative group. They follow the written Torah only. So they do not believe in resurrection. For them, this life is the only life we have because the concept of resurrection is not written in the Hebrew Bible. It comes in the later books that were only written in Greek. So the Sadducees don't accept that writing. So they're more conservative, holding to the Hebrew written Torah, quite powerful group because as priests, they have a degree of power because of temple and sacrifice. So the Sadducees are a significant group within Judaism. Also, there's a group of radical, military-minded people who are opposed to Roman rule. You might even think of them as the terrorists. If they can, they would throw out Rome. And in fact, their zeal to be free of Rome eventually leads to a great Jewish war. So they're the zealots. One of Jesus' disciples was a zealot, okay? A follower of Jesus was Nicodemus, and he was a Pharisee. So some of Jesus' followers, Pharisees and zealots. Then there was another organised group called the Essenes. We didn't know much about this group until the scrolls were found down by the Dead Sea. This is the group believed to be behind the Dead Sea Scrolls. They had a very strong belief that God's reign was about to break in, that they were now living in the end times. That's what that apocalyptic belief means. Believing that they were there on the edge, waiting for the coming of the Messiah. So that's what Judaism looked like. And then in around the late 20s, to that mixed group of ways of being Jewish, another group. Oh, forgot to mention, there were followers of John the Baptist, some who considered that perhaps John was the Messiah. Remember, you might remember that Jesus was asked if he was the Messiah, even asked if he could be John returned to life. So these Baptist followers, so that's another way. And then there are the Jesus followers. They proclaim Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, the one the Jewish scriptures have been pointing towards, the one their ancestors were waiting on. But all of these are ways of being Jewish. And I don't think we've fully grasped that. So these Jewish followers of Jesus, they think of him as a Messiah at first like David. Hail, son of David, they sing out. They continue to follow the Jewish law, the teachings of Moses. Matthew's gospel brings that out very strongly. Not one dot will be changed until the end of time from the teaching of Moses. They continue to attend the synagogue and the temple. Now we can see that happening in the Acts of the Apostles, where Paul goes to various synagogues, he goes to the temple. We know Jesus went to the temple. And we know he also went to synagogues. They followed the dietary customs of the Jewish people. Later on, that became a bit of a problem when non-Jews wanted to join the group. How can we have a common meal when some are following the Jewish dietary customs and Gentiles aren't? So these followers of Jesus are very much seeing themselves as Jews, only now Jews who believe the Messiah has come. They celebrated the great Jewish festivals, they celebrated Passover, Tabernacles, Hanukkah, and of course they celebrated the seventh-day Sabbath. They also value the scriptures of Israel, only now as they read the Psalms or the prophets, they read them in the light of Jesus and consider those Psalms actually point to Jesus. If you did some work over Lent, Mary Reaburn would have been pointing out the Psalms that have very much become part of Christian liturgy that are Jewish Psalms, but they were thought to point to Jesus. Now, within that mix, we know that there would, I'll just go back to that one, into that mix, this Jewish group began to welcome the followers of John the Baptist. We see that in the Acts of the Apostles. Also, Samaritans. So Samaritans are coming in. Now, when they join the disciples, they bring with them slightly different Jewish ideas, because the Samaritans focused much more on the person of Moses, and John's followers saw John in the light of the prophets. And so it shifted the focus from Jesus as a Messiah like David to Jesus as a prophet like Moses. And they have texts that say that. So God says to Moses, I will raise up a prophet like you to be the leader of my people. So there's a slight shift. And gradually, and I'm talking 40 years, 30, 40 years of ongoing wondering about who Jesus was, trying to find in their Jewish scriptures the language to say this. And gradually, they began to think of Jesus in a way, in a divine way, in a way like God. They began to call him Lord. And in Hebrew, that's kurios in Greek, which is the translation of the Hebrew word for Yahweh. And the minute people start calling Jesus kurios, it sounds to the Jewish people, they're calling Jesus God. That's going to cause problems. They begin to even pray to Jesus and say, come, Lord Jesus, come, kurios, Jesus. So these Jewish followers of Jesus, along with all the other Jewish groups, like the Essenes and the Zealots and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, no doubt there were strong arguments among them. No doubt the Pharisees and Sadducees argued about what scriptures to read, with the Sadducees sticking only with the Hebrew and the Pharisees saying, no, there's more. There's writing after that, writing speaking of the resurrection. So we know there were conflicts between the various groups, and into that mix, there would have had to have been conflicts with the followers of Jesus, but these are all conflicts within Judaism. Conflicts over who is the Messiah. Could Jesus be the Messiah? Could John the Baptist be the Messiah? Now, in time, the affirmation about Jesus and his relationship with God really becomes very much Jesus is the divine. Jesus is godlike. And in the Gospel of John, we read, in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. Now, that would have been absolute heresy to the Jewish people, because their great acclamation of faith was, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And now here are these other Jews, the followers of Jesus, saying, Jesus is God. And it sounds as if they're making two gods. So the great Jewish monotheism is under threat. Once Christians start calling Jesus Lord, it looks as if they're putting up a second God. Now, this probably did lead to conflicts in local synagogues, even the exclusion of these Jewish followers of Jesus being excluded from their local synagogues. We read something like that in John verses 9, chapter 9, 22, 12, 42 and 16, 2, that people were beginning to be afraid of affirming faith in Jesus, lest they be put out of the synagogue. But be careful of that. The Judaism at this time was not controlled under one strict hierarchy. They weren't the Vatican, right? They could not make a law that covered everyone. So I prefer to think of these conflicts as local, where Jewish believers and the Jesus believers in a local synagogue come into conflict. We see it in the Acts of the Apostles with Paul. When he starts preaching Jesus the Messiah in the synagogue, sometimes he's driven out even by stones. So understand there's conflict, and it's conflict about proclaiming Jesus God, calling Jesus divine. That sounds as if you're making two gods. Things change in the year 70. And if you're doing this for accreditation, make sure you write the word 70 CE in very large print. A major change happens. Because in the year 70, Rome, there had been a war between the Zealots, the Jewish people, and Rome in this land. And Roman armies came, they surrounded Jerusalem, they starved it, and eventually they broke through the walls into the temple area, setting fire to it and destroying it. That, as you can see, is the hand of someone left as a result of this terrible destruction. That was found in a house in Jerusalem. Now, for us, I think the only thing I could compare it with is this. You can't see that image of the two towers being destroyed without remembering the horror, the destruction, not only on this day, but for years after. What that one event did to the psyche of certainly all the US citizens, but also the world. So the destruction of Jerusalem did that to Judaism. The temple was where sacrifice happened. The temple was the center of the priesthood and its power. But with the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple, well, no temple, no sacrifices, and no priesthood. Also, because of the Roman army, with no priesthood, the Sadducees, who are the priestly group, lose all their power. So they have no more power after this. The Zealots were killed, as many as they could, by the Romans. Even the Romans go all the way down to the Dead Sea, to the last stronghold of the Zealots at Masada. And at the base of Masada was a community of the Essenes. So this is the time also when the Essenes are destroyed, their community destroyed. Thank God they managed to smuggle and hide the scrolls. So no temple, no sacrifice, no priesthood, so no more Sadducees, no more Essenes, no more Zealots. Who do we have left? Who's left within Judaism? Well, we've got the Pharisees, the lay teachers of the law, called rabbis. They're not tied to the temple the same way the priests were. And we've got the followers of Jesus, who from now on I'm going to call Christians. That was a nickname given to them. So these are the only two groups within Judaism that had a hope of surviving after the year 70. And it boils down to the question of who do you follow? Who is the way to God? Do you follow Moses and the law? Is that where the revelation of God is? Or do you follow Jesus as the way to God, as the revealer? And this is the time when John's gospel is developing, in this time. And this is the time where identity is being fought over. Is this the time where there is a much more vigorous struggle between these two groups around who do we follow? Who will lead us to God? So make sure you've understood that question. If you've got questions, put them in chat, and Mary Reaburn, you might take note of them. The author of John's Gospel, I think, is a Jew. I think only a Jew could write what we have in the Gospel of John. I think he is named John, but not the fisherman from Galilee. You know, John's not an unusual name. So one of the early fathers of the church writes of two Johns, John a disciple and John an elder. And I think this John is probably John the elder, not the fisherman from Galilee. But this gospel author knows Jerusalem very well. So he's able to give us information about the pools near the temple, the pool of Bethesda, the pool of Siloam. It was only found in the last 10 years. And of course, he calls the valley at the side of the temple, he names it the Kidron. Now, that information is not in any other gospel, but it is in the Gospel of John. So this author knows Jerusalem very well. He knows the rituals for the various festivals in Judaism. So he writes about the Festival of Tabernacles. He writes about the Festival of Hanukkah and its symbols. Okay, that's in John 10. And I believe he also makes use of the Festival of Pentecost or Shavuot in chapters 1 and 2. He knows Passover. So not only does he know the rituals, he knows Judaism, the Jewish theology that's in these late Greek scrolls. So he knows the Old Testament very well, including the idea of life after death, because that's what Jesus will talk about, life after death. And here he's like the Pharisees. That's what the Pharisees believed also. Sadducees, no, but Pharisees did also. This gospel author at times draws upon the stories told in Aramaic. You see, in the land of Israel, people didn't speak Hebrew any longer. So in the synagogues in the land, they would read the scrolls, the readings in Hebrew, and then read them again in Aramaic. Much like when I was a kid at school, we would have the gospel reading read in Latin, and then we'd hear it read again in English. Well, that's what was happening in the synagogue. And at times, John uses what we find in the Aramaic scrolls as part of his wonderful storytelling, particularly in John chapter 4, where Jesus is talking with the Samaritan woman. And he really relies on something written in the Aramaic scriptures. Come and do John with me, you'll learn more. John also knows first century Jewish theology, where there's a strong sense that this world is now under the power of evil, that God can't even get into this world. God's spirit is withheld because the world is filled with the power of evil. And in the Gospel of John, that power of evil is sometimes called the ruler of this world, or Satan. And at one point Jesus says, now the ruler of this world is driven out. That's Jewish theology in the first century. We get it in Mark as well. Get it in Mark. The very first miracle Jesus does is an exorcism, both in the Jewish area and also when he crosses the lake to the area of the Gergesenes. So that's Jewish theology. John knows it. Oopsie do. I'll just go backwards. There. Sorry. Okay. So now, something else to be aware of, and make sure if you're teaching, your students are aware of it, that all the characters in the gospel are Jews. So all of Jesus' disciples are Jews. Perhaps you take Pilate, of course, no, Roman. The Samaritan woman wouldn't be considered a Jew. The Jews at that time would not call themselves Jews. They would say, I'm one of the children of Abraham. I too am one of the children of Jacob, children of Israel. That word Jews was used by outsiders. So Romans would call them the Jews. To the Jews themselves, they'd self-identify as, we are the children of Abraham. Abraham is our father. We are the children of Israel. Okay, that's quite a significant point. But now without a temple, how do they have their identity? And this is a stage that after the year 70, Judaism is in. How do we reshape ourselves with no temple, no sacrifice, no priests? This is where I mentioned this term, the hoi judaioi, can also refer to those living in the region of around Jerusalem. They're called Judeans. Up north, they're known as Galileans. Sometimes in the gospel, you'll hear that distinction made. He speaks like a Galilean. They must have had a slightly different accent. So people living around Jerusalem from the region known as Judea could be called hoi judaioi. Usually it means the Jews. Important, Jesus, his mother, his disciples, all his friends, they were all judaioi. They were all Jews. When talking about John the Baptist and talking about Jesus going down into the water, the Greek word that's used is baptizo. Okay? And that's why it's called Jesus' baptism. That's fair enough. It's exactly what the Greek says. But if you're teaching Catholics or Christians, they immediately translate it as our sacrament of baptism, as if suddenly Jesus stops being a Jew and is baptized Catholic or an Anglican, right? No, that is a ritual of immersion. And when I'm teaching, I usually talk of it as an immersion in the Jordan River with John. So Jesus wasn't baptized into the Christian community. He went through a very common Jewish ritual of immersion, a form of recommitment, of purifying. Okay. Now, having said all that all of Jesus' followers are Jews, that his mother, his disciples are all Jews, that's not really the picture we get from the gospel. Sorry, that's my dog. From the Gospel of John. Because the gospel creates a picture as if Jesus and his disciples are no longer Jews, that there's something different. And all those other people can be called Jews, but not us. But that's the way the gospel author has created his story. So the gospel narrative creates a different picture to what it would have been historically, where everyone was a Jew. But that's not the sense we have when reading the gospel. Here's some examples. So the author, John, talks about the great festivals as feasts of the Jews, as if you were writing about life on Mars or the feasts of the Martians, people who are not us, people who are other than ourselves. Jesus speaks sometimes to the crowd who are listening to him, speaks about your law, not our law. And the narrator says it's their law, talking about the law of Moses. So it's a deliberate strategy of the gospel author to do this, to make a distinction between the Jesus followers and the Jews. So both the followers of Moses, the Jews, and the followers of Jesus, they share the same traditions and the same scripture. But now, after the year 70, in a time of absolute crisis, now to try and shape their own identity, that other group is looked on as other. We are no longer them. They are no longer us. And the fourth gospel writes as if that separation has already happened. And so the Pharisees, the crowds, are labelled the Jews, or Judaioi, as if it has happened, when in fact that separation really didn't happen clearly until the 4th century. Here it's just at the beginning of identity formation, where these two Jewish groups are trying to clarify, who are we? How are we different from those others, where once we shared the same scriptures, the same traditions, the same festivals, now for the sake of an identity with our temple, who are we and who is that other group? Hope that's clear. Okay, I'm going to give you a break for 5 minutes, coffee time. We're going to make a start again. So if you'd like to regather, bring your cuppa back, and particularly the Bible, because we're going to be looking at some texts and making sure you've got it accurately, because sometimes translations do weird and wonderful things. I want to start with a very powerful statement by Adela Reinhartz. Adela Reinhartz teaches New Testament, particularly the Gospel of John, and she's a Jew. So she writes this: for a Jewish reader, the Gospel of John, in which Jews are portrayed as unbelieving descendants of the devil, blind, sinful, and incapable of understanding their own scriptures, is one of the most disturbing texts in the Christian canon. So if you put yourself in the shoes of a Jewish person, hearing 8:44. So I find these words of Adela very painful. I know her personally. She's had a similar problem to me in that her students thought she was a nun, and she had to say, no, I'm not a nun, I'm a Jew. And I said, well, Adela, I had the opposite. So she's responding to what happens to her when she reads the texts, when she is aware of how some of these texts have been used as weapons to justify pogroms, oppression, being exiled from land, murder. And it is still happening today. There is still very strong anti-Semitism today. Now, some try to explain away the difficulty by translating the term hoiudaioi as the Jewish authorities, or as Judeans, or the successors to the Pharisees, but they're not really satisfactory. The most frequent term which the Gospel of John uses to describe the opponents of Jesus is the Jews. And every few times when the Jews describes those sympathetic to Jesus, they're very rare, and they're far outweighed by all the times they're in a negative conflict with Jesus. It comes to a head in chapter 8, but I want you to start with John chapter 6. If you'd like to open up John 6, please. And when you open it up, you'll see it's John's account of the great feeding miracle. We get it in every gospel. We get it twice in Mark and twice in Matthew, once in Luke and once in John. And in this feeding miracle, Jesus talks about himself as the living bread come down from heaven. So up on the board, up on the PowerPoint here, I've put that it's the feeding of the crowd with abundant bread. Jesus speaks of himself as, I am the bread of life. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood have eternity life. Now, can't explain that here, okay? But look at what happens at the end of the chapter. Because at the end of the chapter, when many of his disciples heard it, they said, this teaching is far too difficult. Who can accept it? And because of this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer went about with him. So from John 6 on, some of Jesus' friends, his disciples, are no longer with him. They find his teaching too puzzling, too difficult. So John 6. Then, when we turn to John 8, if you'd have a look at John 8, verse 31. And this is the text that leads into that statement about you are from your father, the devil. But I want you to look at verse 31 and be clear who Jesus is speaking to. Because verse 31 says, Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him. So he's not saying to the Jews in general, he is talking to those who had been his followers, who had believed in him, perhaps had been friends, and now have walked away. So keep that in mind. This argument is not between Jesus and anyone, it's between Jesus and former believers. And he says to these former believers, if you continue in my word, you are truly my disciple, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And they respond, we are descendants of Abraham. We've never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean by saying you will be made free? And Jesus answered them, very truly, I tell you, anyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. And then he goes into something that I consider a little parable. He says, the slave does not have a permanent place in the household. That's true. Slaves can be bought or sold. And then he goes on, the Son has a place there forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. This bit about the Son has a place forever, that's, culturally, that's absolutely true. Daughters, when they marry, move away from the house. They marry into the household of their husband. So they leave the family home. Sons don't. They bring their wife into the household. So the Son stays in place. The Son remains forever. And slaves, of course, don't have a permanent place. So keep that parable in mind. They respond, Abraham is our father. And Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would be doing what Abraham did. But now you are trying to kill me, a man who told you the truth that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. You are indeed doing what your father does. And they said, we are not illegitimate children. We have one Father, God himself. Again, there's another little parable behind this that was there in John chapter 5 about children doing what their parents do. I'll show you that parable in a moment. But get the idea. If you were Abraham's children, you would do what Abraham did. So children do what their fathers, their mothers do. Now, here's that parable, I think. The principle, it comes from John 5. Children do what their parents, and it's in John 5, verse 19. Whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise. And it's a parable drawn on Jewish custom, where the father would teach the son, this is how you hold the wood, this is how you hammer. The mother would teach her daughter, this is how to make the bread, this is how much flour, this is how much water. So children do what their parents do. And that's the logic behind this whole struggle. That if you were Abraham's children, you would do what Abraham did. Then it goes on. If God were your father, you would love me, for I came from God, and now I am here. I didn't come on my own, but because he sent me. Again, the son doing what the father wants. Why do you not understand what I say? It's because you cannot accept my word. You are from your father, the devil, and you choose to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar and a father of lies. Okay, now, that statement, remember who it's being made to. It's not being made to all the Jews. It's being made to those who were his disciples and who have now turned away from him, are now no longer believing in him. Okay? It's harsh language, but this sort of harsh language seems to have been the rhetoric in conflicts. When there was conflict, it was fairly common to throw at the other person, oh, you must have a devil, or you must be a child of Satan. And I'll just show you the next thing, because when the Jews reply, these former followers, they say to Jesus, are we not right in saying you are a Samaritan and have a demon? So just sit there for a moment. These are two groups, former friends who've now walked away. both are accusing the other of being demons. This is part of the rhetoric. Now, let's go on. Also, part of the rhetoric at this time is a prayer within Judaism. Every morning there was a long prayer known as the 18 Benedictions. And around the year 84, an additional benediction was added. It's just simply known as the 12th benediction. Listen to it. For those doomed to destruction, may there be no hope, and may the dominion of arrogance be quickly uprooted in our days, and may the Nazarenes and the heretics be destroyed in a moment. May they be blotted out of the book of life. May they not be inscribed with the righteous. Blessed are you, O Lord, who subdues the arrogant. Now, that's a fairly harsh prayer, that everyone who's a heretic be destroyed, be blotted out. May Nazarenes, and I think this word Nazarenes is referring to the Jesus followers. Jesus, known as Jesus the Nazarene in the Gospel of John. And before you get shocked by including such a horrible prayer in liturgy, have a look at this. This was what Catholics used to pray every Good Friday. Let us pray for the perfidious Jews, that Almighty God may remove the veil from their hearts, so that they too may acknowledge Jesus Christ our Lord. Almighty and eternal God, who dost not exclude from your mercy even Jewish faithlessness, hear our prayer, which we offer for the blindness of that people. That's a horrible thing. And yet we prayed that every year in our Good Friday liturgy. Thank God we don't do it any longer. Thank God, I think it was Benedict the 16th talked about the Jewish people still in covenant with their God. So the covenant has continued. It hasn't been abrogated. So here's one prayer, whoopsie-doo, here's one prayer from one side of the debate. And here's another prayer. Okay. So if you've got a sense that after the year 70, I'll move that, I don't like looking at that any longer. After the year 70, under the Pharisees, and let's start calling them now teachers or rabbis, Judaism is refounding itself with no temple, with no sacrifice. And the rabbis are putting emphasis on the Torah. By living according to the Torah, they can live a life as good as if they had sacrifice. And Christians, the Jesus followers, are saying, by living according to Jesus, by following the way of Jesus and his teaching, that is the way forward. But two groups who emerged out of the one Judaism are now in this struggle. Now, they didn't develop in two separate continents, so they didn't know each other. They developed from the one context, and that's why there's so much conflict. Okay, might have been different had one been found in one country and one in another, but no, they came from the one milieu. So here's a quick, oh, done that. So here's a question. Who killed Jesus? And if your students can't answer, they were killed by the Roman soldiers, Jesus was killed by Rome, I think you haven't taught them clearly. Because Jesus was crucified, and that's a Roman form of execution. It's not Jewish. And yes, there was collaboration by some Jewish leaders, but not the whole of Judaism. Some Jewish leaders. And the question is, why? Why did some Jewish leaders collaborate with Pilate? And I would answer, they were desperately afraid. They were afraid of Jesus' very popularity with the general group of Jews. Jesus' growing popularity was threatening, not to them, but it could be seen as threatening to Rome. It could be seen as the beginning of a popular uprising. Look at what happens. Look at the text. John 11, verse 45, after the raising of Lazarus, Jesus has just been to Bethany, Lazarus has come back to life, and it says, many of the Jews, therefore, who'd come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. So there we go, a whole lot of believers. And what do? They go to the Pharisees and told them what he'd done. Now, why? Why did they go to the Pharisees? Now, if you're thinking they go there to report on Jesus, I think you're wrong. See, these are Jews who have come to believe in Jesus. They've just seen resurrection. And a Jewish group who believed in resurrection were Pharisees. So I think it follows that they would go and say, hey, guess what? You know, you've been talking about life after death. That's what we've just seen. So I would think some of them go to the Pharisees because they are the ones teaching resurrection. And in telling the Pharisees about the raising of Lazarus, it would be confirming that what you're teaching has been right. So don't immediately see this as reporting on Jesus as a negative statement. I don't read it like that at all. Now, so that's the first part of it. So that's in John 11, verse 46. And then verse 47, now, following that, the chief priests, they're Sadducees, they don't believe in resurrection. The chief priests are the leaders, and the Pharisees call a meeting of the council. Makes a lot of sense. Let's get together. Let's talk about what's happening. What are we going to do? There's their question. What are we going to do? This man is performing many signs. And here is their fear. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him and the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation. That's their fear. The fear that this popularity of Jesus with the ordinary people, the Romans will see as insurrection, terrorism, call it whatever you like. Look at what is going on right now in Hong Kong, in Myanmar, where people coming together, and it looks to the government as this is a popular uprising. So the government comes down very hard. That's the fear. The chief priest can't even celebrate the festivals without first of all going to Pilate, the governor, and asking for the vestments, because the vestments were held by the governor. That was a way. Rome kept control. So the chief priests are walking a very fine line, trying to maintain the freedom of religious worship for their people when they are controlled by Rome. So if you can get a sense of understanding their fear, what are we to do? This man is performing many signs, and if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation. I hear fear. And then Caiaphas, the high priest that year, said, "You know nothing. You don't understand. It's better for you to have one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed." So Caiaphas sees this problem can only be solved by killing Jesus. Otherwise, Rome will come and the whole nation will be destroyed. And then it continues. So from that day on, they planned to put him to death. So yes, there was collaboration with Rome by the Jewish leaders to protect the children of Israel, to protect their freedom with as much freedom as they could have within the land, a land controlled by Rome. Oops. So today, I think Christians today have a moral responsibility to accurately portray the Jewishness of Jesus, his mother, his disciples, and stand up against neo-Nazi racist words or actions against Jews of our time. I don't think we can sit back and keep silent. There is no justification for anti-Jewish vilification or violence. The Gospels do not promote or provide any reason for that religious vilification or violence. There's no place in synagogues, mosques, or churches for the slaughter of anyone in the name of any religious or social agenda. And the fact that, for 2,000 years, we haven't understood the Gospels well enough, that Christians have promoted pogroms against the Jews, have promoted expelling them from certain countries. When Jews were trying to flee Germany in boats, and those boats were sent from one country to another country, and they were not allowed land in Christian countries because they were Jews. I think we've got much to be ashamed of. So read the Gospel of John carefully, read what the text actually says, and understand the context. These are some books that I strongly recommend. Adela Reinhardt's book, Befriending the Beloved Disciple. Raymond Beringer, Didier Polifet, Anti-Judaism and the Fourth Gospel. Paula Fredrickson and Adele Reinhardt's Jesus, Judaism and Christian Anti-Judaism, Reading the New Testament After the Holocaust. More recently, Alan Culpepper and Anderson, John and Judaism, A Contested Relationship in Context. Important. And again, Adela Reinhardt's Cast Out of the Covenant, Jews and Anti-Judaism in the Gospel of John. Well worth reading. Oops, you do. There. Next thing I suggest continue to educate yourself in biblical interpretation, so that if the question's asked, who killed Jesus? You can say, oh, he was killed by Roman law. That's why Pilate had him killed. He set himself up as king instead of Caesar. Okay, so educate yourself in biblical interpretation. And there's some suggestions. I'm at CYTU. There's also Catholic Theological College in Melbourne. And there's some of our courses this year. And like I always do, an ad for your support. And if you desire to continue this type of adult education, we need your help. We can't do it without some support from you. We don't ask a fee for any of this, but we leave it to you. What can you contribute to help? If any of you are really wealthy and close to death, leave us in your will. Or if you know somebody really wealthy who'd like to be remembered by setting up a professorship, John Stewart professorship, or Susan Walker lectureship, what a way to be remembered as somebody believing in theological education, because the future will depend on lay people. And lay people need to be paid properly, and that can only come if we have the finances. So there we are. That's enough from me. I'll hand over now to Mary.
We only have a couple of minutes, Mary, and I really do want to take this opportunity to thank you very much for your wonderful scholarship, for the way you share it and invite us all into the difficulty of the text and into a much, much, much better understanding of the text, so that we don't take on the sentiments that we may, at a naive hearing, first hear there.
Yeah.
So on behalf of the Jewish Christian team of the Sisters of Our Lady of Sion, and on behalf of all those who have joined us tonight, and on behalf of all those who will listen to the recording in time, I really want to thank you very, very much.
Okay, thank you. And thanks everyone for participating. And I get little emails and messages in the chat group.
And I also want to thank Garratt Publishers. We do have a slide of theirs coming up telling you about Mary's publications with Garratt. And I want to thank them for the enormous help they have been in making this talk known. So thank you to Garratt Publishing and to David, who has been with us. Thank you to Mary. Thank you very much to Mark for all his skills behind the scenes in keeping it going.
Okay.
Good night. And
good night. Good night.